My general sense is that the latest war scare in Ukraine is starting to subside, and that we are becoming increasingly less likely to see a war this year. The most important indication of this is the fact that, just as happened in the previous scare last April, when it looked for a time as if Ukraine was about to attack the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and the Russian military responded by a counter build-up along Ukraine's borders. On that occasion, the United States acted quickly to defuse the crisis, getting the President of the United States to telephone Putin, the President of Russia, and arrange a summit meeting. Just as on that occasion, the United States acted to prevent a war in Ukraine taking place, so I get the sense that the United States is acting to do the same thing this time. Now, I must stress, I'm not absolutely certain that this is the case. This is my own assessment of the situation, but I find it very difficult to imagine that the United States would be seriously discussing with the Russians a summit meeting between Putin and Biden if a decision had not been made to try to bring the situation under Ukraine again under control. Now, in saying all of this, it's important to say also that the West European governments, Germany's above all, probably do not want a war over Ukraine. In fact, for them, it would be a disaster and a debacle. And if the United States is advising Ukraine against taking any rash moves to start a war, so I'm sure the Germans are doing the same, at least behind the scenes. Now, there is still, it has to be said, a real risk of a war in Ukraine. And of course, it could be that the hardline neocon faction in the United States will prevail and will get a war started. But it seems to me that the source, the origins of any war would be decisions made within Ukraine itself rather than on the part of the United States. I say that because not only does it seem to me as if the United States is trying to diffuse the present tension in Ukraine or over Ukraine, but it is also consistent with the nature of US policy as it has revealed itself over the last 20 or so years. The fact is that the United States has shown little hesitation in attacking weak powers. It was prepared to attack Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003, Libya in 2011. The United States supported an insurgency against the Syrian government also in 2011 and especially 2012. But it has always held back, recoiled from an open challenge, an open military challenge of the two military superpowers, China and Russia. And this has been a consistent feature. It was the case way back in the early 2000s when the United States acted to defuse incidents that were happening over the South China Sea. And it was also the case, very importantly, as I recall, in 2016 and thereafter, when the United States and Russian militaries almost came head-to-head in Syria, with the Americans always backing off at the last moment. Now, the last incidents are not particularly well known. I would say that there was a particularly dangerous moment in October 2016 when, at a time when the Syrian army was closing in on the insurgents, the rebels, who were fighting the Syrian government in the important city of Aleppo, the United States at that time was talking about launching airstrikes again, or missile strikes against the Syrian military to stop the offensive that the Syrians had launched against Aleppo, or against the rebels in Aleppo with Russian backing. And the Russians responded by deploying extremely advanced surface-to-air missiles. These are not the S-400 missiles, which were, by this point, already well established in Syria, but advanced Ante-2500 anti-missile missiles, which were rapidly deployed to Syria, with the Russian military saying that they were prepared to shoot down both US missiles and, by implication, US aircraft if the United States pressed ahead with that sort of attack. And I remember that the US president at the time, who was Barack Obama, discussed the matter with his advisors, overruled the hardliners, and an announcement came from the White House that the president was not going to proceed with any kind of missile strike. It was not reported in the media, but further confirmation was provided by the Director of National Intelligence at the time, who was, of course, none other than James Clapper, in information, in testimony that he gave to Congress, in which he confirmed the potency of the Russian anti-missile and air defense system in Syria at that time, essentially explaining why the United States at that point had backed off. And it seems to me that we're seeing something similar happening over Ukraine. The United States, as is so often the case, talks up its commitment to Ukraine. It talks about that commitment being rock solid. It gives token supplies of weapons to Ukraine, Javelin anti-tank missiles. Some talk that they're going to be sending Stinger anti-aircraft missiles as well, knowing perfectly well that these will not affect the military balance in any meaningful way, but at the same time wanting to signal, not so much, I suspect, to the Russians, who are, of course, well aware of the military realities in Ukraine, but to the Ukrainian government, and above all to the hardliners in Congress, that in fact the United States' support for Ukraine remains rock solid. But in reality, it is, I think, decided again that it doesn't want to clash with the Russians, certainly doesn't want to clash with the Russians in Ukraine, where the Russians are in an overwhelming position of advantage, and it does not want a military debacle in Ukraine involving Ukraine itself. The Biden administration, seeing one American ally in Afghanistan collapse over the summer, can't realistically afford politically to lose two. Now, it's possible that some hot-headed person in Ukraine will ignore all these American and German warnings and will launch an attack on the Donbass or conceivably even Crimea. Regardless, there is some extraordinarily wild commentary in Ukraine to that effect. In that event, there will indeed be a war, and I'm going to discuss what that would mean in a moment. But I don't myself think that that is what the US government, or at least the people who are ultimately in charge of the US government, Joe Biden's political advisors, want. From their point of view, their overriding priority at the present time is to try to avoid a rout in the midterm elections next year and to hold on to the White House in 2024. A war in Ukraine does not serve those objectives. There are hardline neocons who ache and press all the time for war, and there are deluded individuals like Secretary Blinken who also seem to be committed to some kind of support for Ukraine to the point of risking a war. And of course, there are plenty of people in Congress, people like Senator Cruz and Senator Rubio and Senator Menendez, and there's of course all Republicans, but you can find lots of Democrats too, who always want a war and will always agitate for one because they have no responsibility for its eventual outcome. But the person who occupies the White House and his immediate team of advisors, the people he is speaking to on a regular basis, they understand very well the enormous dangers of a war involving a nuclear-armed superpower like Russia, and they do not want the United States to be drawn into such a war, and they certainly do not want a situation where there would be a military debacle on their hands, which would solidify the probability of a rout in the congressional elections this next year. That, at least, is my assessment. That is why the United States has undertaken this latest outreach to Russia. CIA Director Burns was rushed to Moscow after it became clear that the diplomatic initiatives that the Germans and the French were conducting had fallen apart, and with the United States concerned about a war, we learn that steps have been taken now to set up another US-Russia summit, something that will not be well received in Kiev. Having said this, it's perhaps important to consider what would happen if there was a war, because I think that there are many misconceptions about what such a war would amount to. The first thing to say is that I think that if there were a war like this, it would undoubtedly have an origin in Ukraine itself. And here I want to take on board, I want to directly challenge a theory that has been circulating in parts of the media at the moment about why Russia might supposedly opt for a war against Ukraine this winter. The argument one comes across is that the Russians sense that the situation in Ukraine is turning against them, that they fear that they're about to lose Ukraine because the population supposedly has been won over to the Maidan program and is now fully alienated from Russia, and they're going to start a war in Ukraine before the situation in Ukraine becomes irretrievably lost. The first person to write in that way was a commentator known as Nicholas Gvozdtsev on National Interest, but I've seen lots of other articles now appearing claiming the same thing. This, it seems to me, is completely and profoundly wrong, and it has absolutely no reality behind it. First of all, it's important to say that no Russian leader that I know of has discussed or talked about war in those terms. All of them have talked about a war happening only if Ukraine makes the first move. There's been repeated statements by the Russians that they will respond to a Ukrainian attack, but they will not carry out an aggressive attack themselves. And that already seems to me to contradict that theory. But secondly, the people who write in this way are either profoundly ignorant of Ukrainian realities or are, as is so often the case nowadays, obviously spinning fables. Briefly, if one looks at the situation in Ukraine, if one actually considers what is going on there, the reality, it seems to me, is the diametric opposite of what these commentators who talk about a Russian fear that they're about to lose Ukraine, it's the diametric opposite of what they're saying. Back in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky won the elections in Ukraine on a ticket of making peace with the Donbass and with Russia. And importantly, he spoke Russian he spoke in Russian during his election campaign, signaling an outreach to the Russian-speaking community of Ukraine. And he won the election overwhelmingly, showing that most Ukrainians want peace. That, it seems to me, is perfectly clear. That's clearly what most Ukrainians wanted. Since then, he has gone against his electoral position. He has tried to appease the hardliners in Ukraine, and the result is that his electoral position has completely collapsed. Most of his supporters have become increasingly disillusioned with him, and some of them have become alienated. Apparently, his once rock-solid position in the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, has disintegrated, and it's no longer clear that he has a majority there. And on top of that, he has seen the remorseless rise in the opinion polls of the opposition bloc party led by Viktor Medvedchuk, which openly calls for peace and a re-establishment of economic and political links with Russia. And Zelensky, egged on by the hardliners, has responded to this by trying to close down Russian speaking TV channels, by having Medvedchuk himself arrested, by taking various repressive moves against pro-peace newspapers and websites in Ukraine. Something, by the way, he's been able to do disgracefully with the support of the US Embassy in Kiev. Things have now reached the point that even Kiev Post, an English language website and newspaper published in Kiev, which has taken up to now a rigidly pro-Maidan line, has now been closed, apparently because it was not hardline enough. None of that suggests to me a particularly strong or confident government. On the contrary, it suggests a government which senses that its control is slipping. These kind of repressive moves are more likely to alienate Zelensky's supporters even more than they are to consolidate support for him. And on top of that, what we further learn is that in the middle of November, a concerted campaign against Zelensky was organized by various oligarch groups within Ukraine itself, talking about how his rule over Ukraine is ineffective, and there are even rumors that some members of the political establishment in Ukraine are looking to replace him sometime in the winter because they consider him both incompetent and a threat to themselves. And on top of that, one has to look at the economic numbers in Ukraine, and they are extremely bad. Ukraine has never recovered to the level that it had economically at the time when the Soviet Union was collapsed. It's been in a state, if you like, of continuous recession ever since. The economy is again contracting, and it is being hammered by the rising inflation that is a problem pretty much everywhere, but which is particularly devastating in a place like Ukraine. So there are no reasons to think that the situation in Ukraine is calm politically, and on top of that, there is another major concern. And that is, of course, one relating to gas, the gas situation. It's not just that Ukraine is struggling to buy gas at the current inflated prices on the European spot market, or to be more precise, buy Russian gas at European prices, because it siphons off gas that is being sent down the Ukrainian pipelines from Russia and pays the Europeans for the privilege, even though that gas is intended for European customers. It's not just that Ukraine is struggling to find the funds to do this. It is that the position of Ukraine as a transit state is starting to become increasingly problematic. The Russians, Gazprom, has indicated that it is becoming increasingly skeptical about the wisdom of persisting in sending gas in large quantities via the Ukrainian pipeline network, because that pipeline network has become so decayed, and because the gas fields in western Ukraine that supplied those pipes have started to run down. Gazprom's plan is to supply natural gas to Europe increasingly via the northern pipelines, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, when it comes online, and the Yamal pipeline, which reaches out to the much younger, newly developed Arctic fields, which are the fields which will be supplying most of the gas that will be going to Europe in the next few years. Now, of course, completing Nord Stream 2 has been a complicated saga, and there's always, to this day, continuous intrigue around it. There's been much discussion about why the German regulator temporarily suspended certification. But as I've discussed on our locals platform, I'm reasonably sure that decision to delay certification was not taken out of any desire on the part of the German regulator to stop Nord Stream 2. It was probably requested by Gazprom, as Gazprom sets up a subsidiary company in Germany and transfers the assets to that company in order to comply with German and EU law. By the way, since I made that program on locals, there have been more commentaries about that suspension in Russia, all of which take it very much in their stride, and all of which strongly suggest that this is very much the reasons I have given for that temporary suspension are the right ones. Likewise, the German regulator has apparently indicated that it is still working towards a late January deadline for completing certification, something which rather implies that once this subsidiary company is up and running, probably at the start of the year, the decision to certify Nord Stream 2 will be green-lighted and will be seen through. There will still be a 2-month interval after that happens where the European Union must consider whether or not to rubber stamp the German regulator's certification. But I suspect that even despite opposition to Nord Stream 2 within the European Commission will probably go along with the regulator's decision. So that means that sometime around March, April, perhaps a little later, perhaps in the early summer, we will start to see Nord Stream 2 starting to supply gas to Europe. I would add, and it's a point that I've also made, that the certification process does not mean that Nord Stream 2 could not start supplying gas to Europe now. There is no legal obstacle to Nord Stream 2 supplying the gas today. The only thing that would be risked would be a fine if certification were refused. But the Russians, Gazprom, have taken a decision that they will delay supplying gas until the certification process is completed. So the high probability is that Nord Stream 2 will be in operation sometime this year, probably in the late spring or early summer, at which point the bell will toll on the future of Ukraine's position as a gas transit state. So that is going to be a major crisis for Ukraine, not so much because it will lose the transit fees, calculated at about $3 billion a year, which it pays Gazprom for the transfer of, which it receives from Gazprom in return for the passage of that gas through those pipelines. More importantly, if Ukraine's position as a transit state ends, it can no longer siphon off gas passing along those pipelines to Europe, and the result will be that Ukraine's position will become extremely difficult, because Ukraine will quite literally at that point run out of gas. So there are all of these tensions building up in Ukraine, and one can understand why in the midst of all these tensions, some of the more hot-headed people in Ukraine are looking to start a war in order to try to resolve them in a way favourable to the Maidan project, whereas other people, more perhaps sober and clear-headed people, are looking at the situation from a future perspective, recognising perhaps that the United States and Germany especially are not keen on a war in Ukraine, and worrying about their future position, Ukraine's future position as a gas transit state, and perhaps saying to each other, well, maybe the time has come to shuffle Zelensky to one side and replace him with someone else who can patch up relations with Russia. That, it seems to me, is a much more realistic perspective on the situation in Ukraine at the moment than the one in which charts out a general fear for the Russians that they're about to lose Ukraine. What about the attitudes of ordinary Ukrainians? Have they really become massively antagonistic to Russia? Well, there's no doubt that some are. I mean, there's always that minority of people in Western Ukraine who are viscerally and even fervidly hostile to Russia. But I doubt that is true of the vast majority of Ukrainians. What most of them want, I am fairly sure, is an end to the economic crisis and a general stabilization in their country. They will support whoever delivers that, and if it is a pro-Russian politician, they will support him. I would add that we have a laboratory of Ukrainian attitudes to Russia, and that is Crimea. Now, what most people don't realize is that Crimea remains a major holiday destination for Ukrainians. I've even heard that the largest number of people, of tourists who go to Crimea in the summer, come from Ukraine rather than Russia. Regardless, when they do come to Crimea, they mix with Russian tourists, they use Russian facilities or Russian-owned facilities, and there is no information, there is no report of any tension between those Ukrainians and Russians. There's no reports of brawls or fights or political arguments or protests or anything like that. It seems that Ukrainians come to Crimea, as they always have, mix with Russians who also always go to Crimea. The two get along perfectly well. They mix together on the beaches. They go to the same hotels and sanatoria. They swap stories in the bars and restaurants. They have good times in the clubs. There is no indication of any specific tension between Ukrainians and Russians in Crimea, despite the fact, as I said, that large numbers of Ukrainians go there. Perhaps strongly anti-Russian Ukrainians, primarily in Western Ukraine, no longer do, but my overall sense is that there is not really, that this story about fervid hatred of Russia amongst the Ukrainian population is overstated. Of course, the Ukrainian media is not like that. They take extreme anti-Russian positions. But as I discussed a moment ago, the simple fact is that any Ukrainian media channel, television station, newspaper, website that takes a more measured line on Russia at this moment in time faces the prospect of being closed down, so you're not going to find many of those around at the moment. They probably do not reflect the general feeling in Ukraine at the present time. So I don't think that the Russians feel that they're losing Ukraine. I think, on the contrary, that the Russians feel that time is on their side and that the trend of events in Ukraine is in their favour. Economically, especially if Nord Stream 2 does come on stream this year, as I firmly expect, things are definitely on their side. And in terms of a resolution of the situation in Ukraine, a consolidation, if you like, of anti-Russian feeling in Ukraine amongst the general Ukrainian population, I think those claims are wildly overstated, and I don't think, to be straightforward about it, they are true. So I think that this idea that the Russians are going to start a war because they fear that they're losing Ukraine is a real one. And that is given that I think that the Russians feel that time is on their side in Ukraine. That is a strong reason, in fact, to doubt that they are looking to start a war. But perhaps beyond that, we should consider what might happen if there was a war, because here again, I've been reading all kinds of reports from all sorts of people that a war for Russia in Ukraine would be a disaster, that they would meet intense opposition and resistance from tens of millions of people. There would be resistance in the cities, there would be resistance in the villages, the Russians would face insurgencies and all those sort of things. I have to say again that I think all of this is extraordinarily unrealistic and has little basis in reality. First of all, if we're talking about the Donbass region, if there's Russian offensive, if there was a Russian counteroffensive and it took control of the Donbass and the Kharkiv area, I think most of the people there already feel themselves pretty Russian or pretty close to Russia. I don't think there would be much opposition to Russia there. I don't think there would be much opposition to the Russians anywhere in southeastern Ukraine. That also includes places like Nikolaev, Kherson, Odessa certainly, conceivably even Dnipropetrovsk. There might be a few people who are strongly opposed to Russia, but I don't think that the Russians would have much difficulty establishing their control over these regions or would run into much opposition there. After all, the predominant language in these places is Russian. The people in these places voted first for the Communist Party and then for the Party of the Regions. They seem to want support. They seem to support a reconciliation with Russia. They voted for Zelensky, thinking that he would deliver it, and they're currently supporting Viktor Medvedchuk's opposition bloc party because he says that that's what he wants also. So I don't see the logic or the prospect of strong or intense opposition to Russia in these areas. I certainly don't think there's any real prospect of prolonged and intense resistance to Russia from the civilian populations in these sort of places. What about central Ukraine? Well, first of all, I doubt very much that the Russians have any real plans to conquer or occupy central Ukraine, the region around Kiev, the area of Ukraine which was formerly part of the Tsarist Empire and of the Soviet Union, and which remained Ukraine up to 1939, when the Soviet Union occupied the Western territories, the former Habsburg province of Galicia, and incorporated it into Soviet Ukraine. But let's talk about this region of former Tsarist Ukraine. Well, probably there would be quite a lot of opposition to the Russians there, but I suspect that even there it might not be quite as intense and quite as strong as some people believe. I suspect outside Kiev, in these small towns and villages, that make up this vast area of Western Ukraine, of central Ukraine, I think that most people would probably accept what comes. The present setup in Ukraine has not really worked out especially well for them. They're probably antagonistic to Russia at the moment, but I doubt that this is particularly deep and particularly strong, and I certainly don't think that you would see a massive resistance movement develop there. If one goes further west to Galicia, then of course the calculus changes, and there may be strong Russian, anti-Russian feeling has existed for a very long time. Probably there would be opposition to Russia there. But I'm going to say this. I suspect that if the Russian army were to get to Western Ukraine, all that way west, something which I really don't expect and can't imagine, but let's assume it did. Let's assume someone pressed on, somebody persuaded Putin in Moscow to press on all the way and to incorporate Galicia as well. There no doubt would be quite a lot of resistance and quite a lot of opposition. But even there, I wonder how organised and strong that opposition would be. People tend to overlook the fact that the Russians faced an insurgency war in Chechnya, in the Caucasus, in the 2000s, and despite the fact that hostility to Russia was much stronger there than I suspect it is anywhere in Ukraine except the western regions, the Russians eventually prevailed and seem to have won over the population to their side. In central Ukraine, I'm sure that they would achieve that they would do that if, which I don't expect, they would decided to move that far west. If they moved further west still to Western Ukraine, yes, there would be opposition, there would be strong opposition, but I suspect the reality is that a lot of the people in Western Ukraine, rather than accept Russian rule, would not so much resist it, but would decide to leave and go to the West. That seems to me a much more realistic scenario of what might happen. I want to stress that all of these are, in my opinion, far-fetched and fanciful theories. I don't expect the Russians to try and occupy central Ukraine. I don't expect the Russians to try to occupy Kiev. I certainly don't expect the Russians to go all the way to Galicia. But I think that the constraints, the reasons why the Russians would not do that, are not based on the internal factors in Ukraine. They are based on Russian policies, upon a decision Russia took long ago that it was not going to seek territorial expansion, certainly not at the expense of other countries, that it would act to defend its own, but it would not project outward, and also, of course, concern about the very strong international reaction if it were to behave in the kind of extreme way that some people worry that it might. So I don't think that these dangers exist because the restraints that the Russians have upon themselves are very strong, and I don't think that they will go beyond them. But I think people should be extremely careful about egging on Ukraine into a battle with Russia, which most Ukrainians don't want, which Ukrainians would lose on assumptions of a heroic Ukrainian resistance to Russia, which, to be truthful, would be disastrous for Ukrainians if it took place, but which, besides, I don't think would happen. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel. We'll see whether my analysis this time is right, but we'll see what happens. But please remember also to look us up on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also remember to join us on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU, but especially on Locals, where we publish an increasing amount of exclusive content, and where, by the way, I'm planning to do my next live stream at 1400 EST tomorrow. And you'll find links for all of these things under this video. Please also remember to support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also you can join us. You can support us by coming to our shop, buying the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And please also remember to tick the like button to this video if you've enjoyed this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.